Thank you. Good evening. My slides are coming. My name is Paul-Jervis Heath. I'm a product designer and a service designer, and I've been doing that for about 20 years. So I've worked on a lot of different stuff, from connected home appliances to dashboards for autonomous vehicles to libraries of the future, all kinds of different things. These days, I lead a design practice called Modern Human, and that specializes in imagining disruptive new products, services, and experiences, and then turning those into a reality. So we get invited into large organizations to help them innovate. We get startups come to us with their newborn babies of ideas, and they ask us to turn them into beautiful products and services. But we also work as consultants, so we help clients to embed design thinking into their organization, and we run innovation projects and programs. But this evening on World Usability Day, I'd like to talk to you about conservation. I'd like to talk to you about a thing called the knowledge chain and how academic research turns into real-world impact. And I'd also like to kind of talk about how we're using human-centered design to enable that and accelerate that. You'll recognize this fellow. He's a giant panda. And you might remember in the news a few months ago that there was a lot of coverage about the giant panda no longer being endangered. BBC News covered it as giant pandas rebound off endangered species list. Brilliant. And in their article, they had this little link to another BBC article entitled, "How Did China Save the Giant Panda?" Now, I don't want to suggest that the giant panda isn't a conservation victory, but I do want to consider the context. Actually, when you look at the number of giant pandas in the wild, it's estimated to be about 2,060. That's not a lot of giant pandas. It's true that it has increased. It was as low as 1,200 during the 1980s. And of course, the giant panda's biggest problem, well, they love bamboo. It's pretty much all they eat, but the bamboo forests where they live are threatened by human activities such as farming. So that leads to population fragmentation. You get little pockets of giant pandas, which leads to inbreeding and population threat. Now, the reason for the increase in panda numbers is because conservationists have been working really hard. They've been working really hard to protect the bamboo forest that they live in. They've also been working really hard to reforest areas where giant pandas could live. So now the problem for giant pandas is climate change. That's the next threat for them, because climate change threatens more than 35% of the giant panda's habitat in the next 80 years. So this bear is not out of the woods yet. And while there's been at least a temporary increase in panda numbers, the eastern gorilla has not been so lucky. Eastern gorillas live in mountainous forests in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in northwest Rwanda, and southeast Uganda. And they're not exactly safe places in the world. They're not safe whether you're a human or a great ape. Now, during the past 20 years, grouse gorilla, which is a subspecies of the eastern gorilla, have been severely affected by human activity. Can you believe there are people who eat gorillas? And so they've been poached for their bushmeat. And that's because there have been small mining camps where people eat them for food. There's also a commercial trade in bushmeat. So that illegal hunting has also been facilitated by the number of arms available, right? Because it's an unstable part of the world, a lot of war, a lot of guns about, and so there's a lot of ready firearms, resulting in kind of more people killing gorillas. The population of grouse gorillas has dropped from 17,000 to only 3,800 inhabitants in a single generation. That's a massive drop. The roughly 880 mountain gorillas have been faring substantially better. So for eastern gorillas, there's two types of eastern gorillas. There's the grouse gorilla and the mountain gorillas. And those mountain gorillas have been faring a little bit better. One of the two subpopulations is recovering from an all-time low in the 1980s. And that actually means that the mountain gorilla is the only great ape taxon that has been increasing in number. So in some places, one subspecies of gorilla is growing. In others, subspecies are declining. But how do we know that a species is endangered? And what does it mean to be on the endangered species list? Well, we know because of the Iucn Red List. I don't know whether anybody's heard of the Red List. The Red List is basically the definitive source of information on endangered species. So how do we know that a species is endangered? Because it says so on the Red List. And so we're currently working with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature to redesign the Red List. It's currently kind of in a state where it's not been redesigned for a few years. The information is very current and up to date, but it's not presented in a very useful format for anyone. And so we're aiming to change that over the next few months. And if we look at how these species get assessed and how these how we decide that species are endangered, let's use the giant panda as an example. So the Red List has actually been published twice this year. I think it's published between 2 and 4 times a year. For each assessment, a group of experts basically submits an assessment to IUCN. They don't do that for every publication, only when they consider it worth doing. And to do that, they look at all of the academic literature that's around, they look at all the studies that have been done, they collate all of that material, they write an assessment, they submit it to IUCN. And so if we look at giant pandas, they were reassessed this year and obviously hit the news, but the previous assessment was published 8 years earlier in 2008. And the assessment before that, 8 years earlier in 1996. And then they were published regularly, every between 2 and 4 years through the 80s and 90s. So the Red List assessment is created from academic research by zoologists and conservationists in the field. And it's important for their workflow, but it also has a much wider impact. So research funders choose what research they're going to fund based on what the Red List says about the species in it. Supragovernmental organizations like the UN and the EU decide policy based on it, as do national and local governments. Researchers are influenced in their research topics by it. They look for interesting research topics based on the information in the Red List. NGOs and conservationists decide what actions they're going to take to protect animals based upon the information in the Red List. You've also got people who are doing research for things like Planet Earth, who are using it to check facts. You've got journalists using it to check facts, TV and radio researchers. And so it stores lots of interesting and useful information about endangered species that might get published as well in textbooks and used in geography classrooms and things like that as well. So it has this wide kind of impact, and it all starts with academic research. In a similar area, we work with the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, and we redesigned their Protected Planet product. So Protected Planet is based on something called it's all acronyms. It's WDPA, which is the World Database of Protected Areas, of course. And the aim of that is to halt biodiversity loss and ensure sustainable and equitable use of natural resources by all the countries on the planet. So that's a pretty big mission. Protected Planet is essentially the public-facing front end of that WDPA, basically. And scientists and academics use Protected Planet to get the latest protected area data for their research. So whether they're looking for things about biodiversity and habitat loss and climate change, government employees, protected area managers use Protected Planet to compare different protected areas and find out more about global conservation and best practice. Business ecologists. I don't know whether you've ever worked with business ecologists. They basically use Protected Planet to understand restrictions that might impact on their company's operations. So on both Protected Planet and Red List, we're basically looking at the flow of information and the impact of that information. And we wanted to understand what it's used for and when that information was most closely used. So of course, we conducted design research. Let's start with Protected Planet. On that project, we wanted to understand the information that enabled conservationists to act. So Protected Planet is used by a really wide range of stakeholders. And our initial design research set out to discover the diversity of their needs and look for kind of common goals and behaviors. And so we conducted remote research with field-based conservationists in 18 countries. So Botswana, Nigeria, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Brazil, Germany, Italy. And what we were looking at specifically was their needs and their typical behavior when using the Protected Planet product and their values for it. And we asked them to keep diary studies about their work, looking at what they did on a daily basis, the resources they used, the decisions they took, the organizations they had to influence, how they went about influencing those organizations, and all of the information needs and information flows from Protected Planet and the impact of that information. And so we got an in-depth look at how conservation happens. When we started work on the Red List, we wanted to understand what zoologists do. I was like, yeah, okay, so what does a zoologist do all day? And so we did, it's really hard to follow these guys. We wanted to shadow them, but it would mean flying all over the world with them as they kind of counted meerkats and stuff like that, which would have been really cool, but massively expensive. So we actually did contextual interviews with them in their labs when they got home. And we interviewed them about what they were doing. So we spoke to one brilliant academic who was investigating the impact of an invasive bird species on native flora and fauna in the Galapagos Islands. And so the birds that she's studying are apparently really smart. And so she'd designed a special trap to trap these birds. And she'd use her mobile phone with the mating call of the bird behind the trap to lure this bird into the trap. And they're an invasive species, right? So once you've caught them, you can't just let them go because they're kind of ruining the environment. So she had no choice but to kill it and dissect it and look at what it had been eating. And by looking at what it had been eating, she could work out the impact of this invasive species on the Galapagos Islands. So these are marine iguanas. So if you watch Planet Earth 2 last weekend, you'll recognize these guys. These were the guys that were being chased by the snakes, right? That was an incredible piece of television. But that program said that 80% of extinct species are from islands, and invasive species are one of the biggest threats to those species. So these people who are going out and doing this kind of work where they're catching invasive species and gutting them and working out what they've had for lunch, that's kind of really important to understand how that then affects native species like the marine iguana, or the snakes that chase them, I suppose. The thing that struck us as surprising about the zoologists was that their actual information needs from the Red List were pretty simple. The Red List occupied a real niche for them in their information needs. They used it at the beginning of their research to prove the potential impact of their work with a funder, and then they'd use it again later when writing a paper to follow forward citations and look for information related to the species that they were interested in. And then they'd use it to support positions on various topics. But their predominant use was academic literature, which the Red List doesn't cover, or only as citations. And then after hearing about that, we kind of wanted to get to the opposite end of the spectrum. So these were really specialist, very expert in their field. We wanted to go to people who knew much less about conservation. And so we rocked up at London Zoo and did some co-design sessions with teachers. We basically invited teachers in and looked at how they plan lessons, geography teachers at Key Stage 3, 4, and 5, and looked at how they plan lessons and what information they used, and looked for crossovers then between the academics and the teachers. Now, it turns out that really only Key Stage 5 and top-end Key Stage 4 young people will do their own reading, but teachers use a lot of PowerPoint in their lessons, and so images and videos are key. Otherwise, it's, again, very basic facts. So from those two projects, and a number of other projects looking at academic research and publishing, we noticed patterns in the way that information flows and then creates impact in the world. Because academic research doesn't exist in a kind of bubble. It actually kind of leads to things like cures for cancer and conservation actions. And what we wanted to try and understand was, well, how does that happen? How does somebody in a lab working on chemistry end up curing cancer or inventing a new material that gets into a mobile phone or saving a giant panda or whatever it is? And so we mapped the knowledge chain. Now, everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with the concept of a supply chain. A supply chain is a system of organizations and people and activities and information and resources. And they're all involved in moving a product or service from supplier to customer. So supply chain activities involve the transformation of natural resources, raw materials, components into a finished product that's delivered to the end consumer. So we started to think about, you've got this supply chain and could you then apply that to academic knowledge? Were there similarities that we could draw? Thank you very much. And it turns out that there is, because ideas are like raw materials. And like raw materials, they're driven by demand. So demand by funders, demand by publishers, demand by institutions, demand by things like the Research Excellence Framework. And in modern academia, there's also a method of production. People will hate it when I call it when I say it's like a factory in a supply chain, because it's nothing like a factory, but it occupies a similar position as a factory would in a supply chain. Basically, it turns ideas into knowledge, and that's the research lab. There are distributors of that knowledge, and they're like the stores in a supply chain. And like a sustainable supply chain, it's cyclical. Academics create new knowledge. That new knowledge gets recycled as ideas to feed into new knowledge. And so that knowledge chain is what produces real-life outcomes in the real world, such as conserving pandas or curing cancer. So if we walk the knowledge chain starts with an academic, and depending on their discipline, they'll either work on their own or they'll work in a group. So there's an economics in research, I suppose. And if you're a mathematician, then basically you need a whiteboard, you need a Sharpie, you need a whiteboard pen, you need some coffee, and that doesn't cost so much. So you work alone. If you're planning to accelerate particles up to the speed of light or close to the speed of light in order to recreate conditions at the moment of the Big Bang, you need a lot more money. For one thing, you're going to need to dig up half of Switzerland to bury your proton accelerator beneath it. And you've got to pay for indemnity insurance just in case you're the one that creates the first homemade black hole. And so we've got the academic, we've got the research, and the research project starts with finding funding. There are lots of funders of research, the funding councils, organizations like the Wellcome Trust, but also charities. So the Cancer Research, British Heart Foundation, they're all organizations that actually sponsor research. And so I'm sure everyone here has worked on proposals and pitches. This is slightly different. When we're working on proposals and pitches as designers, we're usually responding to a client brief, whereas an academic is typically following their research interests. But there's still an element of selling your ideas in both situations. A researcher has to demonstrate the impact of their research. And they'll quite often have to specify the experiments they're going to conduct before they get funding to conduct them. And I spoke to one scientist who was working on antibiotic-resistant pathogens, which is not easy to say in front of a crowd of 100 people. And she said to me, if I knew what we were going to find, we wouldn't bother doing the experiments. The whole point, you get the specified experiments out of the way quickly so you can get on with actually discovering things. And you find that research groups follow a path of research interest, and you see research themes emerge from their work. So, and for some research group leaders, this is how they spend their time. They spend most of their time chasing funding and making sure their research group has funding while other people in the research group do the work. So there's an idea, there's a proposal for a research grant, and that's kind of the first place where the Iucn Red List and things like it get involved. Because the first use of the Red List for an academic is, as an academic, I want to cite a reliable source to show that a species is endangered or is invasive in order to go and do some research on it and work out what we should do about it. Once funded, the academic returns to their research or their research group, and the research group leader has probably been working with one of their postdoctoral researchers on the protocols and the methods for the experiment that they'll undertake, and that's the point where the lab work starts. And so, at that point, they'll go away and do the research. And the outcome of a research project will be a set of research outputs. It's not like the outputs of a kind of design project, in that there will be a set of academic papers that get published in journals. There'll be a set of conference posters, a set of presentations. There'll be a whole variety of kind of publishing outcomes. There'll be different publishing strategies that the groups take, depending on their motivations and what they're after in publishing. And on publication, some of the articles will hit the news. research groups will, or the journals that they're published in, will launch press releases to the press about the research that's happened, and some of that leads to major national coverage in newspapers, on the BBC and Radio 4 and things like that, and you see academics getting interviewed. And the next interaction with the Red List, and where the output of a research project becomes an input into the next kind of link in the chain, is the Red List. So what happens is the research paper gets published, the assessor comes along, they look at all of that evidence, they then produce an assessment that says the giant panda is no longer endangered, now it's only vulnerable. And so that Red List assessor will pick up all the relevant papers, pick up the data. Sometimes the academic will be involved, but sometimes the assessor won't be related to the academic and won't consult academics. They'll just read the academic papers. And so academics may be asked for their data, they may be asked for further details about their paper and findings, and that's the kind of source of raw information that goes into a Red List assessment. And then that data gets published on the Red List website. So the knowledge chain is the academic needs funding to do some research on a species, they apply for a research grant, they reference the Red List to prove the species is important, they get the funding, they do the research, they write an academic paper, and then in the impact link, an assessor comes along and produces an assessment, or an assessment group comes along and produces an assessment and may reference those papers. But that kicks off a whole chain of events. So a conservationist who then wants to actually take actions on the ground to save a species, they have to get funding too. They have to justify what they're doing to organisations. And so they reference the Red List, they get funding, they carry out their conservation actions. Or a journalist is working on a project, and they go to the original source of that information, which is the Red List. Or a teacher is teaching about the Amazonian rainforest, and the Red List then becomes an authoritative resource for them to do so. And so the Red List is at the heart of this kind of chain of actions. It provides information to a range of people, different types of information, and what they then go off and do feeds back into conservation actions, which feeds back into research, which feeds back into assessments. So the Red List project is currently in full flight. So we're designing the digital product. We're using the knowledge chain to map the information needs of different user groups. We're trying to understand the impact that particular information may have. There's tons of detailed information. So we're developing kind of, the Red List is kind of full of all kinds of information, from kind of population statistics to really detailed kind of coverage of kind of species threats and things like that. And so we're having to develop different layers of information. And going back to that researcher working on Galapagos and those marine iguanas, it turns out Galapagos is an interesting case because it's part of Ecuador. So if you want to search by country, it's very hard to find information about species that are native to Galapagos. And so we've invented this tool where you can draw a polygon on the map around the Galapagos Islands and see all of the, or any part of the world, obviously, and see kind of species in those areas as well. So that you can search by polygon and things like that. So it's feeding directly then into the design of the Red List. And so what I've tried to show there is kind of what could be years of work for different kind of groups and different organizations, and how the kind of somebody studying something on a remote place like the Galapagos turns into a conservation action, which feeds back into the loop, but also leads to teachers teaching in a classroom, to programs like Planet Earth as well. So I hope that's been useful, or interesting at least.
Do you have any questions? One over there, yes. Question.
Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Fascinating project. But the work you're doing is clearly has value beyond your client. So your client is interested in answering a particular problem you've mapped out a much broader world. How do you make full use of what you've learned?
I think the lucky thing that we've been able to do is, because we've worked on those two projects, but also we've worked in academic publishing, and we've worked with the University of Cambridge on future libraries. We've had a lot of exposure to the different kind of constituent parts of that knowledge chain. And so what we can do is we can actually try and understand at a deeper level what's going on and what I guess the systems at play within that. And then it's really about how we leverage that on different projects and how we get it. We talk about it like this, and we kind of put it out there and kind of talk about how we think about these things and stuff like that, so that other people can use them and can then kind of look at how you could use you can use exactly the same model to work out how you accelerate, say, biology. You know, one of the problems in science today is that there's a replication problem. And so the first thing that anybody coming to do an experiment will do is try and replicate the experiments of other scientists before them. And because of how academic publishing works, there's this problem where people don't publish all of the data. What you basically get is you get one of those Paul Hollywood recipes from Great British Bake Off towards the end, where it says something like, bake a Victoria sponge. And so you get people trying to replicate experiments where they're still having to experiment to replicate the experiment. And that holds back, you know, at this moment in the world, there are hundreds of PhDs trying to replicate experiments that have been replicated hundreds of times. And that's what's holding back science. And so, you know, the more we can do to get open data out there, to get open access to articles, all of those kind of things help with that. But it's only when you've got a model like that and you can point to those things and say, look, these are the levers we've got, that you can perhaps, hopefully, make a difference. Who knows?
Any more questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you kind of came across and how you dealt with some places like in Africa with the mountain gorillas, the conservation areas being set up to protect them, and yet the people that moved in from around other places were killing the gorillas to stop the conservation areas they could live there.
Well, we didn't come across that because obviously the conservationists and the zoologists that we were talking to would have come across all of those things. Unfortunately, we didn't go out to Rwanda to visit mountain gorillas and things like that. We're just designers, so all of the people who do obviously do get exposed to all of that that kind of stuff. And so all we could do was kind of interview them when they came back, understand the issues that they were facing, but also kind of get them to keep diaries and things like that so that we could understand what it was like to be a zoologist in the field. Because I had this picture in my head of Galapagos as, you know, being very kind of remote and there not being any kind of internet and stuff like that. And they went, no, we've got internet. There are towns on Galapagos, you know that? I went, yeah, of course there are. Yeah, I knew that. Of course I did. And so, you know, you kind of come with preconceptions, and those kind of activities where you ask people to record things kind of challenge your own preconceptions. But we did then speak to another zoologist who stranded herself on a desert island for 3 months at a time. And so she would literally catch a boat, get a lift from some fishermen. They would leave her on a desert island, and she would just hope that they would come back at the end of 3 months and actually pick her up again. And she had, you know, no electricity, no running water, none of that kind of stuff. She had to take all of the water with her. And so you speak to these kind of different things, and it kind of throws your preconceptions out about what people are doing and what field work means and what different areas of the world are like. We don't see it directly, but we get to hear a lot. We get to live vicariously through our research participants, which is wonderful.
I was going to ask about the diary studies. Like, how were people quite open to giving you quite a lot of information? And how long did you do? What period of time did you do them over?
So with any of our studies, what we try and do is find representative periods for you know, like what behaviour are we interested in observing, and kind of how long does it take that behaviour to kind of manifest itself. So we've done you know, diary studies for a mortgage, for example, where we've kind of done diary studies over 3 months with interviews at regular intervals. For the conservationists, it was I think it was 3 or 4 weeks. It's a little while ago then. But you could see kind of information needs within that, and you could see where they were looking for information and stuff like that. So you can do shorter things for shorter kind of activities that you're interested in.
Are they quite forthcoming though?
Yeah, embarrassingly so. So I've got. You're always surprised by what you get and what people tell you, because it's like they forget that you're not their friend. Or therapist. I actually think it is therapist, because of course quite often we're using remote diary platforms, And so they feel like they can pour their heart into this diary platform, almost like you would like a paper diary, and they almost forget that there's another person at the end of the kind of at the end of the. So I've got one that's going on at the moment where somebody's written about a problem that they're going to the doctor with, and I really didn't need to know. It wasn't the study isn't about medical information or anything like that. But she wanted to talk about it, and so I got the details. Lucky me. And those kind of things do happen, and I don't know what it is about the psychology of a diary study that encourages people to do that, but they really are magic. Yeah, they really are magic, and the questions that we're asking in the diary were not related to anything like that. So yeah, people do kind of put an awful lot of detail in there that you don't expect, and then of course you get the people who kind of fill in the bare minimum and all of those kind of things as well. So you just have to take the rough with the smooth, I think.
One more question?
How do you analyse the results of a diary study?
So we use a platform called Dscout, and Dscout's pretty good because it's got a few kind of basic analysis tools built in. But then what it will allow us to do is it will allow us to drop out a CSV file. And so we can drop it into Excel or Numbers. We can produce pivot tables, and we can do all of those kind of things. So we're currently running a study where we've got something like 400 entries over 2 weeks, and then it's like, well, then you get into the fact that you kind of need a spreadsheet to analyze that kind of set of data. We've never gone as far as doing kind of routines in R or anything like that. But we have got geospatial data in this study, so that's another option where we could kind of start to combine data sets and things like that. But to be honest, my favorite approach is to get a Sharpie and a set of Post-its and to write down the observations that you think are important and then just affinity sort them, right? And that's as valuable as any kind of the technical stuff's good, and it kind of reassures you that your kind of the things that you think you're getting out and the work that you've done with your Sharpies and Post-its kind of make sense. But I think that's my favorite way of doing stuff. Get it on a wall, affinity sort it, work from there. Sometimes you get too much data to be able to do that, though, to be fair.